Welcome everybody to our Women in Science and Healthcare series. This is the Centennial series in honor of Rosalind Franklin's 100th anniversary since her birth. So I'll just jump right in. My name's Lise Elliott. I'm a professor of neuroscience and chair of the Foundational Sciences and Humanities department here at Rosalind Franklin and Chicago Medical School. And today it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Namandjé Bumpus to speak in our Rosalind Franklin Centennial series honoring women's advancement in science and healthcare. Although our areas of research are far apart, I discovered Dr. Bumpus's work through a powerful essay she published in Nature last July about how white senior academics still fail to recognize racism in our institutions. As the first Black woman to chair a department at Johns Hopkins and also the only one currently leading a pharmacology department at any U.S. medical school, Dr. Bumpus is uniquely positioned to bring light to this critical issue. So before I go further with Dr. Bumpus's bio, I just wanted to as well welcome Nahe Kim, who is a co-host for this session and will help moderate our panel discussion. Nahe is a second-year medical student in CMS with a background in public health and a lot of activism around health disparities. So welcome, Nahe, as well. So Dr. Bumpus is the E.K. Marshall and Thomas H. Marin Professor and Chair of the Department of Pharmacology and Molecular Sciences at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Her research focuses on the mechanisms and genetics of drug metabolism in affecting the outcomes of antiviral therapies and is funded by multiple NIH grants. Dr. Bumpus received her PhD in pharmacology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla, California, before joining Johns Hopkins as an assistant professor in 2010. Dr. Bumpus currently serves on the council of ASPET, which is the American Society for Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics. She previously served as chair of the NIH's Xenobiotic and Nutrient Disposition and Action Study section and as associate editor of Drug Metabolism and Disposition. She's the past secretary and treasurer for the Division of Drug Metabolism at ASPET and a member of the awards committee for ASPET and the International Society for the Study of Xenobiotics. Dr. Bumpus has been honored with many awards, including an Early Career Achievement Award from ASPET, a Young Investigator Award from the American Society for Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics, and the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers awarded by President Obama. Dr. Bumpus is author of over 50 peer-reviewed papers and has mentored dozens of students at the undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral levels. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bumpus to Rosalind Franklin University to speak on how sexism and racism squash talent and impede progress in STEM. I should say that Dr. Bumpus will just give some preliminary comments, and then most of this session will be open for Q&A. So please enter any questions in the chat box. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Bumpus, and again, welcome.
Thank you very much for that invitation, and it's my first time speaking to you all at your institution, so I'm really glad to be with you even virtually. So I really do think that discussion is the best way to talk through and understand these issues, but I wanted to give some comments just to kind of frame it and to show you how I think about things and kind of what my point of view and experience has been. So in thinking about this series and also this session, I really like this title of how racism and sexism squash talent. But as I thought about, what would I say? How do I think about each of these things? I realized that in some ways, being a Black woman, sexism seems to at times not resonate with me in the same way that racism does. And I'll tell you why. And it's really in part because the ability to center sexism as part of my experience is difficult both personally and in a broader societal sense. So part of this is intersectionality, right? That Black women and girls, as well as Latinas and Indigenous women, experience an intersection of sexism and racism. So while sexism and racism are distinct forms of discrimination that manifest differently, the effects are compounded for Black women and for certain others. And it really creates a unique experience of discrimination where it's hard for me to separate what I'm experiencing when. And so when you experience both at the same time, there really is a discrimination that's perpetuated that impacts opportunity gaps, including in science. It limits Black women's access to educational opportunities, and it impedes our career advancement. So you'll see, for instance, in 130 years, for me to be the first Black woman to lead a department at Hopkins, I mean, we certainly have had women of other backgrounds. So this intersectionality really compounds things, and it leads to, for instance, in science, a real deficit in the presence of Black women, Latinas, and Indigenous women, not only in science, but in leadership roles and in the more senior ranks. But another piece of this beyond the intersectionality that I really experience and I see around me profoundly day to day, there's almost in our society a denial of womanhood for Black women. So we really are denied kind of this idea that even sexism is what we experience. And part of that is because these kind of dueling, these intersecting identities we have, we're often put in a box of you're not really a woman, you're Black. So I'll give you an example of this. So for instance, in popular media in 2016, Julie Delpy, you may remember, writer, director, actor, nominated for Academy Awards for Before Midnight and Before Sunset, said, I think very poignantly, he said, 2 years ago, I said something about the Academy being very white male, which is the reality. And I was slashed to pieces by the media. It's funny, women can't talk. I sometimes wish I were African-American because people don't bash you afterward. If she was African-American, she'd be a Black woman, right? And I think that this is something that's not about an individual. We see this all the time. So for instance, in our common language, we use terms like women and minorities. What does women and minorities mean? Where does a person like me sit? This is not then about, single misguided individuals or someone misspeaking. Her quote, what she said, goes to this deeper idea that we have that really we aren't existing as both. And this is something that we see all the time, and it's ingrained and it rolls off our tongue so easily. So when we say women and minorities and we put it on our websites of our institutions, and I quarrel with the word minority, and we can talk about that later. I actually think it's a very disempowering term that we need to retire. But when we do that, you're not creating a space for me and for other women like me. And when I ask people, women and minority, where do I sit? It's almost a no-brainer to them. Of course, you're a minority. So I think that's something we need to think about. It's important to look at the contributions of women to science and medicine, but we have to be willing to acknowledge a very unique experience that exists for certain women and understand how our language and our actions is marginalizing those women, even as we try to elevate women overall. And this manifests itself in other ways. So beyond, that language, and I'll also say, that constant messaging in society, women, minorities, women and people of color. What effect do you think that has on a girl growing up, on a young woman, even a professional woman, to always hear this either or proposition? Your existence is an either or. I think we need to think about that. But it goes further. So, scientific conferences, I've seen papers lately, certain societies patting themselves on the back. Oh, our scientific sessions are now 50% women. I look at it, I don't see a Black woman, a Latina, indigenous woman in sight. So what have we really accomplished? Are we creating opportunity for everybody when we talk about creating opportunity for women? How do we move towards being about all women? I think part of it is this acknowledgement. And just in thinking about opportunity gaps and the wealth gap and all of these things, the same thing comes to mind. So as I mentioned, in science academia, we don't see Black women in leadership most often. But things we hear commonly on the radio, even my colleagues will quote, women make 82 cents on the dollar. And I always shudder because I know for Black women, that number is actually more like 63 cents on the dollar. For Latinas, it's more like 55 cents on the dollar. So again, creating inclusive narratives, this idea that women includes all of us and then includes women like me, and also acknowledging that we do have a unique experience and that even these stats and opportunities that open up for women aren't open to all women equally. So this specificity of experience, when you're a Black woman, a Latina, Indigenous woman, as I mentioned, there's a really specific discrimination faced. There are really specific systemic barriers that go beyond sexism alone. And I think that acknowledging that fact does not diminish the experience of other women. So if we're really going to be allies to each other, or even our male allies, the idea has to be that we are willing to acknowledge this, the existence of this, the fact that there's really these specific barriers in place. It does not diminish anyone else's experience. It does not mean that you don't experience discrimination if you're, for instance, a non-Black woman. But to continue to deny this specific experience is damaging. And if we want to move to a place where we really are seeing inclusivity in science and academia, that is something that's really important for us to overcome. We need to really be willing to acknowledge this intersectionality and the impact that it has. So for me, there's a strange thing that really happens to me, when I assert that something discriminatory has happened to me. And it's interesting because, as I mentioned to you, people, if I say my women are minority, I often get, no, you're a minority, you're in that box. But because of people's discomfort with racism, if I say that something racist has happened to me, that is often, something that's basically dismissed. And I will have sometimes women of other groups, of non-marginalized ethnic groups, say to me, well, it's just sexism, we all go through it. I think that we can't have it both ways. If we are going to say that, someone certainly, that their identity is influenced by their race, and we're even going to kind of put them in that category, then you can't at the same time say that, they can't experience racism. The other thing that happens in this instance that I hit upon a little bit in the article that Lise mentioned is that when something racist happens to me, many of my white colleagues, when they hear about it, will respond in a very flabbergasted way. But often what comes next is a denial, and even an insinuation that I must have somehow done something to warrant that response. So I've had, for instance, things happen to me that are unmistakable. Someone not too long ago took a picture of me, wrote the N-word on it, put it in the inbox to my lab. At first, there was a lot of shock, not just institutionally, but nationally when I told colleagues. But quickly, some of those same people turned to start saying, well, is there a reason someone did this? Who out there doesn't like you? Why does someone not like you? Maybe you did something to someone to make them mad. We often focus on trying to explain the things that affront Black people, and I'll say particularly Black women, I think. We try to debunk the racist act instead of really addressing the culture, and even more important, the trauma of the person on the receiving end. So part of this thinking more deeply about the language we use and what we're really saying and how we respond to people is really what's necessary to make people that are on the other end of many of these instances, people that are marginalized and underrepresented, truly feel included. If we're going to make science inclusive in academia, it takes more than diversity offices. It takes more than an officer of diversity who often has no real authority. It takes really thinking about what we're saying, what we're doing, the messages we're sending, and who we're including all the time. It also means that we have to stop expecting Black people, including Black women, to swallow these things when they happen and to move on without actually making any changes. Just because to you, for instance, something may have happened a while ago and you've moved on, you have to acknowledge the trauma that someone feels and that trauma accumulates. Another important point is that the few Black women, for instance, that make it to academia and rise through the ranks, you have to think about the layers of what their experience has been. These things that I'm telling you about, this silly note that I got, that's not a first. That's not because I, became a full professor, someone suddenly did that. It's been my entire life and it's been very cumulative. So I'll just close with telling you, a little bit about my journey. So if I reflect back on my journey and I think about, what it's taken for me to make it here, certainly we know the academic path is hard. to become a full professor, to be a department chair, all of those things, even earlier, graduating from college, getting your PhD, postdoc, those things are tough, very hard to do. Takes a lot of grit for any of us. And we all have our experiences. Everyone has a diversity story. Everyone has had adversity. That doesn't take away from what someone else has experienced. So with me, if I reflect on my journey, well, the first time I was confronted with a racial slur used against me in a violent way was in 3rd grade. It was a classmate. But by that time, by 3rd grade, I had already been told for several years by teachers that I couldn't be a scientist. The first time a teacher told me I couldn't be a scientist, I was in kindergarten. I came to school excited about getting a chemistry set for the holiday, and my teacher laughed. This is an experience that builds. This is why we lose people. This is why even the difficulty of becoming a professor is compounded by hearing these voices that you've been hearing since you were 5 years old, telling you can't do something, and by the world telling you who you are and what you should be. Moving on from that, same thing, middle school teacher, girls like you don't go to college. It didn't matter that I was a straight A student. High school, same thing. I've experienced that at every single step, that very active discouragement. And so what I would say is that if we really want to create an inclusive environment in science and academia, it takes a lot. It takes looking at ourselves, as I mentioned, thinking about what we say, who we mean when we say we, who we're including. With women, who are we actually providing opportunity for when we're talking about women? Are we making sure that we're not creating opportunity for some and simultaneously squashing, to use the word in the title, other women? It also means thinking about our colleagues from these so-called underrepresented groups and the trauma that they are experiencing, not only in the environment of higher education, but that they've experienced all along to get to where they are. The fact that many times we're the first, we're breaking glass ceilings, we have no beacon, no one to look to. It means moving beyond discussions of diversity and really thinking about how do we move to anti-oppression, anti-racism? How do we really turn ourselves into a unit as scientists, as academia, that are creating opportunities for all and that are willing to be brave enough to recognize everyone's experience and the discrimination they face. So I think with that, I'll end, and I'll just say that with racism and sexism, for me, I experienced both simultaneously at the same time. And that if we can move to a point where we can acknowledge that exists for many of us, and there are other types of identities, certainly that intersect and compound things, then I think that's when we're more likely to achieve this inclusivity that we say we desire. And thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bumpus. That was very, very, very powerful. And of course, it's always hard to get inside somebody else's shoes, but I think you allow us to do that with your courage and your powerful words and experiences. So once again, I'd like to invite our audience, our sizable audience, to please enter any questions in the chat box. And I think I'll actually open it up immediately because Dr. Lawson, who's our director of global initiatives for the medical school, asked a question, but he's also been the leader of our task force for addressing racism in our curriculum. What guidance do you have for addressing colleagues who deny the existence of structural racism or sexism?
Yeah, so one thing I've found is kind of what I tried to hit upon. A lot of people, we're all intelligent people, right? And many are aware on some level of things. I think people feel somehow personally diminished by acknowledging someone else's experience. And so I think that we have to create a space, and I try to introduce, everyone has their diversity story. Life hasn't been a crystal stair for anybody. I totally acknowledge that. I know that even the most privileged person still has had their pain. So I think if we start from a let's share our story, we all have a diversity story, people become more open. And with me, at least with colleagues, when I start that way, they are more willing to listen. I think a lot of the denial, I mean, certainly there's people that want to deny things, but a lot of denial comes from a discomfort, but also feeling I've experienced something too, and they feel unacknowledged. I think we have to separate that. You know, with this article I wrote in July, I had a lot of people, you know, send me positive comments, but also had some negative people emailing me, you know, I'm this identity and I've gone through the same things. It has nothing to do with you being Black, why you experience these things. And I think that it really comes from people not feeling heard and feeling that their pain is being unacknowledged. And I think that, you know, that's not what we're trying to do. So some of it is just doing some bridge building, I think.
Thank you for your response, Dr. Bumpus. I wanted to bring up the next question in the chat here. We have Nora, who is interested in hearing more on your thoughts about how using the term minority or other labels can be counterintuitive. This is something that she has considered, but would appreciate your thoughts on it. I know previous in our session we talked about too your thoughts on using people of color in that term as well. So if you could speak to both.
Yeah. So, you know, I grew up an activist. My dad was an activist. My grandmother was a civil rights activist. And one thing that I was always taught from a young age is language is thought. Think about, you know, what you're saying, how you label people, what effect that, you know, has on them. It shows what you think of them, but what effect that has on them. I think there are a lot of things we say because they roll off the tongue. They're quicker, they're shortcuts, but they're often disempowering and they go against what we're trying to accomplish. So I said earlier, people of color. I get it. We want a simple, quick way to say who we're talking about. But the issue is, it's this normalizing of whiteness. It's that whiteness is the norm and that's the baseline, and everyone exists compared to them. So this idea of I'm a person of color, compared to who? Color, who's not a color? Who am I? Why am I a person of color? It's a baseline. It's this fact that being white is normal. We put it forward as a fact. It, in our society, is definitely put forward that way. And that the rest of us, you know, deviate from that in some way. So I understand people feel some pride in that, the solidarity across groups. I think we do have to think about, though, what it really means and what we're really saying. And even that indoctrination that comes telling children all the time, you're a person of color, person of color. I think that we indoctrinate that normalcy of whiteness as, you know, this is really, you know, where we're at. I mean, I had a friend once tell me, everyone's born blonde. She said, everyone. And I thought, no, not everyone. Actually, not the majority of the world. But I think that we just so easily can, you know, say these things because we're so inundated with them. So that's why I don't use color. Minorities, I feel, is similar, but a little bit different. One thing that bothers me about the term minority is that it's actually not really mathematic when it's used to talk about people. So for instance, we know Congress, right? We change parties, we say the minority and the majority. That makes sense. That's based on numbers of people. I've been in Baltimore where the school system is 80% Black and had people calling the kids minorities. And I'm like, it's not mathematic. It doesn't change with context. So if you, no matter where I am, are designating me this, it's not situational, it's my identity. Now you've really minimized me. You know, why do I want to be minority to be really my identity and who you think I am? So it wouldn't bother me if it was a mathematic concept, but the idea that you are chronically labeling me this way, no matter what situation we are in, I think that it diminishes. I think that it is disempowering. I think that it has a negative effect on people hearing themselves referred to this way their entire lives. And what's the opposite of it, right? So people say majority or they say dominant. I mean, I have colleagues who call white people the dominant group. That is, you know, problematic, right? But that is what comes, I think, in part from the use of this language that we're using. It's not a big step to go towards the dominant group and then what that really means. So I think it's just not using the easy term, just thinking about what we mean, because language is thought, it has an impact, and it especially, like I said, impacts children hearing this their entire lives growing up, you know, how they feel about themselves, how they feel about others.
That's definitely a powerful statement, right? That language is intentional, it has an impact. And so I wanted to segue into a different question with In addition to the language impacts, there is definitely some institutional build, and you said that it's continuous. So what are some barriers that you see? And I know you mentioned a solution in your Nature article, but are there any other solutions that you can put forward in addressing these barriers for women pursuing science, for individuals who are Black, who are Indigenous, who are Latinx, who are pursuing science? What are some barriers and solutions that you could guide us on?
Yeah, so I think there are, many barriers. And I said it's a hard path for anybody, certainly, but I think it can be exacerbated with one, you don't see yourself there, two, but I do think there's this chronic discouragement that happens that's not always very subtle. Sometimes it can be just why you? Or it can be someone very actively telling you, people like you don't do this. And it's hard to overcome. I remember, for instance, going to see my lab for the first time, and the person that was showing it, the staff person showing it to me, basically refusing to show me. I said, I'm here to see my lab space. And they said, no, you're not. And I said, I'm Dr. Bumpus. And they said, we're not meeting with Dr. Bumpus' assistant. We want to meet with Dr. Bumpus. And I said, well, that's me. And, as a postdoc, I couldn't get my ID from the ID office because they thought it was an error that there was PhD on there. And I think I was the only Black postdoc at the time at all of Scripps. So, these things add up and they sound silly. And people say something like that happened to me. Somebody didn't want to let me on the bus or whatever. Yes, those things happen. But I think when there's a high frequency and a consistency of your achievements being denied, of your identity being denied, it adds up. And when you don't see people that look like you to counterbalance that, it's not that I'm experiencing this, but then I look up and I see a room full of Black women at a scientific conference, or I see, Black chairs, Black deans, you don't have anything to counterbalance it. So it becomes difficult. I'll say it also takes a toll on students to watch Black faculty with these experiences. I think that one way that we overcome it is one, I think the discussion, certainly. And at institutions, the discussion's not just among the faculty, among everybody. I think that everyone in the institution needs to understand that, we have folks from a range of backgrounds here and they're doing all types of things. I think that there also has to be a strong moral compass that's set by leadership. I think that often, we hear, and I've had it at every institution where I've been, something egregious happens, there's kind of talk among people, but there's not really any high-level leadership to come in and say, this is improper and this is why. Or if they do, it's kind of in a we accept all people. It's not we are specifically calling out this incident that was improper. So I think we need stronger leadership that's willing to really confront these things and put themselves out there. I also think that, as I mentioned, kind of the diversity officer thing, I am very supportive of that, but you've got to give those folks actual authority to do things, to make changes. They can't only be, counselors who can listen and make suggestions. They actually have to be empowered to address things when they happen. They need to, for instance, be involved on the same boards that other leaders are. They shouldn't be outside of the table, when there are board meetings and things like that. Often the position is not elevated in the same way as others, even if it's given a VP title, it's not always treated like a VP, for instance. And I think that goes a long way. And of course, there are other things, I think pipeline programs are great, but I do worry about them sometimes because, I say, if we bring in, students from these underrepresented groups, we mean well, but we're just putting them into this environment that we haven't, fixed. We haven't constructed a positive environment for them. We're putting them in this environment that's antagonistic and racist and sexist and everything else. It actually, I think, can end up going against what we're trying to do and giving those students a feeling that they don't belong. And I've talked to students that told me after summer experiences, they felt like, I like science, but this is not a place for me. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually have a little bit of the same reaction to some of the girls in STEM programs that, it singles them out in this way that they, need all this extra help. And it's in some ways sends a wrong message. But I wanted to steer it back to a couple of questions. There's great questions in the chat. We want to ask as many of them as we can. And I'm going to sort of combine a couple because, you know, this language is so important. You know, there's so much meaning and emotion in it, and you know, many of us struggle. You know, we're constantly updating our terminology, trying to be more polite or thoughtful or sensitive. And so, one of the terms we use is underrepresented, and I don't know what your feeling is about that term, but we certainly use that a lot for science and medicine. I mean, it's a key category in admissions, for example. And then there's a related question about the book Caste or Caste, excuse me, and the use of the term dominant and not, and wanted to get your feeling about that.
So as far as underrepresented, you know, I think that if you're really, you know, talking mathematics, then it's not a perfect term, but it doesn't bother me as much. I do think when you couple it with underrepresented minority, you're doing too much. Like, I think that it's a little bit hitting somebody twice. But what I found with the term underrepresented, which, like I said, it's not the best term, but I'm okay with it if it's mathematical. People don't like overrepresented. If you're willing to call someone underrepresented, you need to be willing to accept that some people, maybe including you, are overrepresented. And that's the problem. If you cannot say that and you don't feel comfortable with that, then to me, you know, you are a little bit diminishing someone when you're so comfortable calling them underrepresented. I've got to say, in my article, I deliberately used the word overrepresented, and that was the thing that I got attacked for, and even my life threatened for most was, you know, when the people that emailed me pictures of bodies hanging from trees, it was that overrepresented word that they didn't like. And so that is what bothers me about the underrepresented, is that I see that overrepresented is such a trigger that upsets some people, not everyone, and makes people feel like they've been attacked. It shows me that you are comfortable with the underrepresented because it's still putting someone, you know, in some way you're diminishing the person.
I find that something that we see quite often, using, you know, underrepresented, the direct opposite would be overrepresented, and you're not wrong in using that term. So I find it very telling that individuals are reacting to that use. And in line with that, I wanted to combine two questions. One was, so when it comes to comments like that are harmful, and, you know, when it comes to your teachers who said, you know, you can't be a scientist, that's not what you scientists, no, that's not something you can do, you know, as a person who's hearing that, maybe, you know, later in their career, as someone who's in college or pursuing a graduate degree, do you find that ignoring those comments are worth, like, where do you find the value in addressing that? Is it effective to speak to that? You know, what are some of your tactics in confronting sexism and racism?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think those things really do pile up and affect people, and everyone, you know, we know with everything, everyone has a different threshold, right? So there are some people that way earlier would exit the STEM pipeline because of those things. There are some people who would persist, and I'm sure there are people that wouldn't even have noticed it like I did, and it would have, you know, totally washed over. So I think that everyone has different thresholds is one thing, and we have to recognize and be okay with that individuality. You know, my approach has always been that I speak up. So, you know, my whole career, even now, people, if you speak, you'll be blackballed, you know, don't say anything. This idea that you've got to take it. So I said racism, like Black people are supposed to swallow it, or, you know, sexism, women, we're supposed to just swallow it and deal with it. I don't want to be part of a community where if I speak, I'm out and I'm done. You know, I get that happens, but in academia, you know, if I've gotten to this point and I've invested this much, if that means that to remain in academia, to remain a professor, to remain a chair, that I can't speak up when something doesn't feel good, or if something feels even violent, then I think that's an issue. So I actually always speak. You know, you don't bicker with every single person. There are definitely things that I ignore, but you know, one thing that I said in the article that I've heard a lot, with every award, with every grant, it's always been from a colleague, often a very well-respected, you know, colleague. Well, you know, you got it because you're Black. Even though the data show, for instance, NIH grants, that we actually are very unlikely to get grants compared to other people, even when you normalize for the institution you're at, your pedigree, all of those things. So I think one approach would be to swallow it, but I always try to reply in ways that make people think. So with that, I wrote, my response is always, you know, that suggests that you cannot envision a situation where a Black person is the best candidate. And it always makes people pause. So it's hard sometimes to not respond in a very visceral way. And I feel like that's one thing Black people, we actually are denied visceral responses to things because of these stereotypes of violence and aggression, and it can even be unsafe for us to respond in a human way that anyone else can respond. But for me, you know, knowing that, but also my personality, I try to say things in a reflective way to make people think. It doesn't mean that I change them, but I got it off my chest, and you know, at least they paused. And you know, sometimes at least I feel like I've planted a seed. So that's been my strategy kind of all along. When I was a kid, not really. You know, I would in some instances speak up. I think it's a lot harder when you're a kid though, just the power differential between you and teachers who are often the ones saying it. But now I always speak. And I think that in some ways it's moved my career forward that I've spoken because I don't have regrets. I'm not, you know, letting anyone, you know, kind of take my dignity from me. And that makes it easier to keep going through all of this. And I do think you plant seeds and people listen and you gain respect by speaking. So I always tell trainees, don't take that advice, don't speak, it's over. You need to speak, it eats up if you don't. Don't speak if you don't want to, but if you want to speak, you should feel you should speak. And we need to support people in that and make sure that we, you know, create an environment where people can.
Yeah, I love that line from your article about, you know, does that mean you can't imagine that a Black person would win this award? That's really very powerful.
People always pause because that's what they're saying, but it rolls off the tongue. It's something that people are so used to saying, you got it because you're Black. It's so, people, it just rolls off the tongue. They're not even thinking about it, and it makes them think about it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I want to ask a question from our head of HR, which is something, again, that we struggle with the language in job ads. Let me just find this up and read it verbatim. How should we verbalize in job ads that we want to increase our diversity? Are there terms that are more appropriate rather than saying women and minorities are encouraged to apply?
Yeah, so I think that there are many things that we can do. I think that one, even though most institutions are scared of it, I would love to start seeing we are an anti-racist, anti-oppression environment. I would love for institutions to get the courage to say that instead of just saying we're pro-diversity, and which should mean more than it does. It doesn't mean so much. It's been very watered down. So I would love stronger language, but you have to back it up with action. So I think, you know, actually the approach of having people write meaningfully about their, you know, how they would contribute, what work they would do. I think there are ways to word it around where it's not necessarily to say what's, you know, your activism going to be, but where you get more than I was the only something in whatever class, where it's actually, you know, this is what I learned, this is what I want to try to bring to wherever I go, what leadership I want to have in that area. I also think those essays can be very telling about people's worldviews. So I do like asking folks to write and take the time to put their thoughts on paper. But I think it'd be stronger instead if we said, how do you feel about anti-discrimination and how would you, you know, contribute to that versus diversity, which makes people really, you know, whatever. I was the only violin player in my family. Like you get all types of things with that. I also think I like the all women. I really like when people say all women. I'm so heartened because it feels that they are talking about me. when I see, like I said, we're so used to women and minorities, whatever, that I even feel better about all women and also, you know, minorities, or I don't like the term minority, but I'm heartened when I see people say all women. I think that it's a way to affirm and reinforce. We know that this term has been fraught and is in many ways referred to certain people, but we really mean everybody. So I think that's one way to strengthen it too. You can call out, you know, specific groups as well instead of using minority. It's a finite group you're talking about, right? So you could do that. But as far as women, I really like affirming it by saying all women.
That's great.
And that's a really easy thing to do too, right? Just adding that in word all, I feel like just has that profound impact of being inclusive.
It means a lot.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to take that to heart in my efforts as well in communicating with others. I wanted to read off a question here from a student. He wrote, "Hello, Dr. Bumpus. Thanks for your talk. Some of us might have heard that back in December, a report revealed that Johns Hopkins, the namesake of your institution, who had previously been assumed to be an abolitionist, was revealed to be a slaveholder. That legacy is unfortunately still very relevant, with Hopkins being the hospital where Henrietta Lacks's ovarian cells were taken without her consent, and the university remains a force of gentrification and violence within the Black community in Baltimore. How do professors, especially those with administrative power, challenge those legacies and make sure our academic institutions aren't forces for oppression in our communities?"
That's a really good point. I think for me, I'll speak, you know, personally from my standpoint. So one thing that was poignant with that news, and that I've been very upfront about at Hopkins, is that at the same time, because there's so few Black faculty, like most institutions, but you know, you can look up our numbers, there aren't very many. I was the first Black woman hired into a basic science department in the history of the institution, you know, in 2010. So we don't have many Black faculty, we definitely don't have many Black scientists. But the same moment that I'm processing this, I've got, you know, 40 something students emailing me who want to talk as they process. And I love students. Of course, I want to be there for them. But it was this interesting moment of course, I'm going to help them and we're going to talk. But I'm shouldering this in a way that other department chairs aren't, for instance. I'm processing this in a way that other department chairs aren't. And I think it really just brings to bear kind of the experience and just how much Black faculty and Black leaders shoulder, certainly. I think when we hear this news, whether it's Hopkins or Georgetown or wherever, you know, we're not really surprised. We know the history of the country, but I do think that you feel disappointed, you know, when there have been narratives that there, you know, have been opportunities potentially to understand, you know, earlier or early on. So that's certainly something that I had to grapple with. I think the other thing, you know, being a Black faculty member, one of those in these settings is that you feel very much like many universities, like was mentioned with Hopkins, many universities have this antagonistic relationship with the local community, the Black people that live in the community. They've, you know, removed their housing, they've done all types of things. So it's a very antagonistic relationship. And when you're a Black faculty member, it's difficult because you feel a solidarity with people, but at the same time, you're part of this institution that is marginalizing them. I think that that's a feeling that many Black faculty have nationwide. So for me, I try to be vocal about these things. You know, I've been a vocal advocate, for instance, for campus crime announcements, for removing Black male 8 to 21 when it's not useful in identifying this person. You don't need to tell me it's a Black male 8 years old to 21 years old. That's ridiculous. So, you know, because those things not only does reflect how we feel about, you know, the people that we share our community with and that we're part of the community with, but also the people inside, you know, that doesn't feel good. So I try to be vocal about the language we use, that we don't say, you know, those people, the Baltimore community, that we are part of Baltimore. And there are many people that feel that way too. Around the Freddie Gray protests, I was very vocal about, you know, using the word riot when we don't use the word riot, when people look a little bit different. You know, just really trying to be thoughtful in our messaging, in our language, and, you know, doing as much bridge building as we can and community sharing people that live there, but it's a difficult spot to be in, definitely.
I have a question from one of our faculty, Dr. Oblinger, who asks about the pandemic and the fact that so many women have lost their jobs at catastrophic levels, many times as a result of not having childcare. And the issue is likely worse for minority women and would certainly impact women trying to gain higher education. How can we best address this actively, both locally and nationally?
Yeah, I think that's a major issue. And I mean, like the person asking the question said, there are these data showing an even larger effect on Black women, Latinas, Indigenous women. So I think that we have to think about this. So, one thing I thought about is how do we have deliberate, opportunities created? I think that it will be important for, universities have an important part to play with hiring practices, just like I don't know of your city, but if you target, certain zip codes for hiring, I think that there will need to be special consideration for women in those zip codes and women in general. For us, even though it's a different problem, obviously, someone at the faculty level, but we still saw the career impact that the pandemic is having just on women balancing childcare. So trying to put things in place, supports for that, whether it's release from some responsibility, whether it's, the institution creating pods so that there's, something to help with the childcare aspect, at least with older people, whether it's giving money to employees directly from the university for childcare expenses. I think that's important. And it's something that can be done, not just faculty, should be done for staff too across the board. So, I look from the university standpoint, and I think we can do targeted hiring certainly, but take care of the folks of all wage levels, but especially people that might be, making fewer wages by, infusing support through both person resource support, but also money.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think that ties well. Personally, as a student, this is a question that resonates with me. Something that Maria had asked is, do you have any thoughts on how we as students can hold leadership accountable for creating a culture of anti-racism? I feel that sometimes it is difficult to trust any institution as fighting for equity because it does upset historical balances of power that people are invested in. And as students, I do think that we feel those strong power imbalances between our position and that of institutional leaders. What ways can leaders demonstrate their investment in these changes and their support of students advocating for changes? Have you seen any examples of institutions doing this successfully?
Yeah, and I think that there's always more that can be done. And students, I think, are great because they're often at a point where they really see these injustices and really see them in a very raw way just because of their kind of perspective in the world. They're, not part of the leadership, maybe trying to maintain the status quo. They are, coming up and seeing things, I think, often in a more honest way. And, have the ability, I think, to verbalize those things. So I know that it's difficult. I think one thing, identifying faculty allies. I think going straight to leadership, some leadership meeting, people often, even when I've visited other institutions, work with them, they listen to this and then what happens afterwards. I think that what's much more effective and what I found effective when I was a student, really one-on-one meetings or, group of you, but one faculty really trying to get the allies that will stand up with you and speak up for you. But another thing I think is being vocal with other students. So there are, students also that, may not be making the environment as inclusive as we hope. And those are future leaders. I think the students, yes, need to hold leadership accountable, get faculty allies that will help you, get to board meetings, meet board trustees, and have these conversations. But I think that holding other students accountable and thinking about the educational climate is really important too. So for instance, I was visiting an institution that was having a pie in the face contest, a student sponsored pie in the face contest. You got to pay, I don't know, $20 to put a pie in a faculty member's face. And it was a medical school. So I kind of was a little bit surprised by it. And I said to the students, I said, well, you know, what happened to do no harm? Throwing a pie in someone's face, you know, that's not necessarily what we're trying to put forward as scientists and doctors. And also a pie is not, you know, nutritional food, but you're in a city, there are a lot of people with food scarcity, and here you are paying to put a pie in someone's face. It really looks insensitive. And I think that some of the students hadn't realized that, and also faculty involved hadn't realized it. And when I talked to more students, there were some of them that said, yes, there is this climate among us where there are, you know, these kind of differences in worldview. You know, you all are the future leaders. I think that having this discussion among yourselves is important, but also get faculty allies and hold faculty feet to the fire. But students do have a lot of opportunity to, I think, influence the climate more than they realize.
Thank you. Yeah, our students had a fundraiser with the pie, and it was in the middle of winter, and I didn't want to get, it was a pretty thing, I have to tell you. So I appreciate that there's many reasons not to that. I do want to bring our dean, Dr. Archana Chatterjee, is with us, and I'm not seeing her face, but I know if I give her the opportunity to ask a question or make some comments, then she'll appear on my screen. So can I turn it over to you, Dr. Chatterjee?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Elliott and Nahe. This has been a wonderful session. Dr. Bumpus, I want to thank you on behalf of the medical school and the university for taking time today out of your busy schedule to speak to us all. Really appreciate your very powerful and personalized messages that you've given us. You've given us a lot of food for thought. We are, like every other institution, I believe, in the country and across the world, really struggling and trying and working towards becoming a more equitable, a more just institution, one that will serve not only our community, our students, our faculty, and our staff, but also the community in which we reside, the community, the larger community to which we owe a debt of gratitude for being part of that community. So I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. And it was very interesting to me personally to hear some of your commentary around language and the words that we use and how important those words are to pay attention to. I'd like, if I may have a moment, Dr. Elliott, to share a very recent story with you that will illustrate, I think, what Dr. Bumpus is talking about a little bit more from, again, as you said, we all have these stories, right? So my daughter, who is a medical student at a different university, is in a rural rotation. It's a very white community in which she finds herself, and it's not unusual for her. She grew up in Nebraska and South Dakota, and so she's very familiar with being sort of not a part of the majority community. But one thing she shared with me last night, which took her aback, she just started her rural rotation on Monday, and she said one of the administrators asked her what her nationality was. And so she said it took her aback, even though she's, you know, born and brought up in this country. She's very aware of all of these racial issues that you have addressed. I am very proud of her in the sense that she took it in stride, and she said, you know, I felt like saying I'm born and brought up here on the same nationality you are, but what she did actually say was something to the effect that her parents had immigrated into this country, but she was born and brought up here. And again, I don't think that necessarily comments like that or questions like that are intended to be harmful or disrespectful. It's just, I think, thoughtless. A lot of the time, people say these things without thinking about it. And what you have encouraged us today to do is to really be mindful and thoughtful as we go forward. So thank you again very, very much for your presence here today and your comments. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for this discussion, and thank you for your leadership. I certainly heard amazing things about that. For me, it's very heartening, certainly, to see a woman as a dean. think that that's rare. And so thanks for doing that. I'm sure you had to persist through a lot to get to that point. So thank you for persisting. Yeah, what your daughter experienced certainly is common. Yeah, I remember going to interview in grad school at a Midwestern university and having the students say, we all had a bet, you know, to see what country you're going to be from. I was like, wait, what? So those things happen. Like you said, we take it in stride, but I do think, you know, it's a microaggression, right? Even though it's not meant to be, it is a microaggression. And those things do add up and they deplete energy. So if I'm constantly explaining to you, yes, I'm from here. Yes, I can speak English. Yes, I can do, that's taking time away from the things that I could be focusing on, and other people may not have that same distraction. So those things add up. And kind of maybe the last thing I'll say, or I don't know, last thing I'll say about this is that the language thing, we don't be afraid to make mistakes. None of us are perfect around the language thing. It's just thinking about what we're saying, challenging it. When we say things, challenging it. What are we saying? Why am I saying that? Why is that what everyone says? What does it really mean? I think is important. You know, I work in HIV. And, you know, early on in my faculty career, I was giving a talk and I was starting to do research, clinical studies looking at transgender women and differences in pharmacokinetics and transgender women. And I said, rolled up some transgender issues, and someone stood up and said, you know, I'm not an issue. And I thought, you're not. I should not have framed it that way. And we frame it that way so often, and it rolled off the tongue. Even me as a, you know, an anti-racism, anti-oppression advocate who thinks about these things, even for me, something like that rolled off the tongue, but it's not something I would do again, and I have to think about it. So I think don't be afraid to make mistakes, and just challenge yourself to keep, you know, trying to think more inclusively about what you say and what you do.
Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about. I think we are all being stretched and challenged in we didn't anticipate this year, and it's been one of the more rewarding experiences, and I think I have a lot of faith is going to make long-term changes. So there were many, many questions that we couldn't get to. Obviously, tremendous interest in your being with us today, as well as your work. And I just want to point the audience to these very accessible articles that you've written in Nature and Science now. We didn't even talk about your piece in Science on the importance of diversity in clinical trials, and your own work on drug metabolism, diverse people, and how important that is both for testing and for practice. So maybe our pharmacology department, our College of Pharmacy, will be back for a scientific seminar. There's so much more we'd love to learn from you. So thank you on behalf of Rosalind Franklin University and the Chicago Medical School for joining us today. Our audience. We, in honor of our 100th anniversary of Rosalind, we sent you our Centennial mug, and I just want to recognize the reason for this series and honoring the tremendous contributions that our namesake made on behalf of women of all women in science. And so I need to finally just finish by thanking our wonderful staff and members of our committee that supported this series. First of all, I want to thank Nahe for helping me moderate this panel. As I said, she's been a tremendous voice for diversity in the students here. And behind the scenes, I want to thank Nicole Ulibarri and Jay Moat and Kara Bass, who have helped orchestrate this really wonderful series. And finally, last but not least, Christine Burgess, my co-chair of the Women in Science and Healthcare Committee. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Bumpus, and thank you all for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.